Alright. Yeah, so I got cut off last time. Um, Taking a little while to get back to it. I haven't re-listened to it or anything. I don't know if any of it makes sense, but I thought I should just pick up where I left off. I remember I got cut out talking about just the scientific method and how it's actually employed, um, and kind of some of the mistakes and the confusion around what's going on there. Sorry, I have my fan on. If it's squeaking, I don't know if you can hear, but if you're wondering what that is, actually, you know what? I'll try to turn it down. Yeah, I could see that getting aggravating if you can hear it. So basically, I think I was talking about epidemiology and how just it, I first want to state that this is a great way to look at truth seeking in general. Like, how do we figure out things about the world, about empirical facts? How do we determine facts, if we can at all? Which I would say is quite contestable. Um, is everything empirically provable or falsifiable? Is in the sense that, can we figure everything out through physical methods or like scientific experimentation? Can we? Does that really tell us everything? Can it? Well, first of all, I'd say no. It can tell us a lot. It's extremely helpful if used properly and if understood properly. But just to illustrate again, for example, in the nutritional world, there's nutrition is a pretty young science. I always use it as an example for this kind of a thing, because it's a fantastic example. Also, I know it very well. But yes, science is nutrition is a very young science. I mean, we can look all the way back to Plato and the Egyptians, and they had all kinds of ideas and writings about different diets and how they could be used in different ways. But if we're talking about the way things are done today with the scientific method, uh, nutrition has been kind of played around with here and there over the last 100, 200 years, but it's nothing really in depth has been done. Nothing compared to like controlled trials with medication, for example, right? And where a huge amount of confusion comes in, again, we're not just talking about nutrition here. This is, I know I'm going to say it again and again, but this is an example of how truth seeking is applied to the real world. And I'll tie it into larger themes afterwards, so bear with me. What is very confusing about nutritional science today is that most of the studies that are done, and if we can even call them studies, which they often are today, and this is an issue that's argued over a lot, is that most of the studies, I don't feel comfortable even calling them studies, but most of the research done in nutrition is epidemiological, meaning it's basically glorified surveys that gets paraded around and touted as science. There's a number of problems here because it's, as I said, it's glorified surveys. It's basically, they just give you a paper, and depending on the format of the study, say every month you fill out a bunch of questions about your current health status, what you remember you've eaten on average in the last week or something like that. And this is done over time, in some cases, sometimes over large populations, just to gather information. And I think that that's a fantastic exercise. It's a fantastic preliminary exercise to actual science because we can gather interesting information this way. But there are huge, huge holes in how this is done, and often it comes down to the individual survey or study. We have to actually assess the validity of the methodology of that individual study or research campaign. And this it's boring stuff for most people. I love it because I've gotten really deep into this stuff. I started getting into this stuff out of necessity, and eventually I saw how it has real life implications, real tangible insight could be gleaned from this stuff. So I can relate to it in a way that I think the average person doesn't. I've worked with a pharmaceutical company before in clinical trials, and the average doctor doesn't know this kind of stuff. They don't. A doctor isn't a scientist, for example. I just want to. I mean, this is, I guess, a little bit aside from the point, but a lot of the time, they've done studies on the average doctor, and over 70% of them don't really know how to assess research at all. For example, just give you that that perspective. Not to say that they're idiots or anything; they're not trained for it. And a doctor isn't a scientist; they are a practitioner. They are they aid in treatment. Anyways, so basically, epidemiology. Yeah, it's interesting what you can get from that, but there are a number of fallacies that come in and confound the details because you can't get anything better than correlation out of this. So what do I mean by that? In scientific discipline, it's undisputed that correlation does not prove causation. So what does that mean? Just think about it this way. If you see a fire and you see firemen, do you think the firemen caused the fire because they're there? Does one equal the other, or is it more complicated than that? It's just a little, it's not even that much more complicated, really. The firemen come because the fire is there. Well, so just because two things are there doesn't mean that one causes the other directly. What's another good example here? Well, you can look up, there's this website called Spurious Correlations. I don't know if it's .org, .com, or whatever, just look it up on Google. But they show on these graphs all of these correlations that are 100% correlations. So, or almost. So like things that are completely irrelevant to each other. Like the number of Nicolas Cage movies over the years and the incidence of deaths by drowning. And it's crazy. You see on the graph, the line for Nicolas Cage movies goes up. The number of drownings goes up. It looks like they follow each other. So what? Do we think that the number of Nicolas Cage movies causes people to drown more? If there are more Nicolas Cage movies, more people drown? Or is it that when more people drown, there are more Nicolas Cage movies? This is completely ridiculous. There's no connection there, and maybe there is a very distant connection of some kind, but we can't assume that there is just because the correlation is there. So, for example, when people in certain large epidemiological studies, I always have a hard time with that word, but in some large-scale epidemiological studies, we see that how do I say? Here, there's a lot of things that we see, but in some cases, in just some, not all, meat consumption is tied to, say, heart disease risk, right? Not all-cause mortality or anything, but just heart disease risk. So we find this correlation. It's tenuous at best, and often it's crazy. Some of these studies, they control for factors. I'm using air quotes there. I don't actually use air quotes, but I'm just saying. I put that word in quotes in your imagination. They control for factors. So if they can't, if they just assume something, then they modify the numbers a little bit to fill in that gap. That is not science. That's insanity, in my opinion, because it's pure assumption. Anyways, don't want to get too complicated here, but well then, okay. So we see this correlation of there's like 0.002% more heart atherosclerosis, heart disease risk when eating more meat, right? Something like that. And let's not get ideological. I could just be using a fake example right now, but it's still valid just to illustrate what I'm saying. So, okay, we see this correlation. It's like, oh, okay, when you eat more meat, then it must cause heart disease, and then you have to come up with a mechanistic reason for this. So what they say is, oh, okay, well, we find cholesterol build up in the arteries in heart disease, and meat contains cholesterol, higher cholesterol. So eating the cholesterol in the meat, it just causes more cholesterol to be moving through the body, and so it's more likely to build up in the arteries and then cause a heart attack. Well, that's nice and neat and everything, but the problem is, if we look at studies all over the world, epidemiological, I hate calling them studies, but we look at this research in different countries, we get very, very different results. In Japan, in Eastern Europe, in Iceland, in southern Europe. I don't think there's a lot of other places where a lot of these kinds of studies are done. But mostly we just see this connection of atherosclerosis and meat in the US and kind of in the UK and around those regions. But then in everywhere else, when we do epidemiology, all of a sudden we see that meat is associated with better health. So why is that? We can't assume, based off of the studies that we looked at, that I was mentioning first, that do show a connection between meat and atherosclerosis, that it's that direct a tie. There must be another factor involved, right? Well, I could go on and on about all the assumptions that are made here. I think it's fairly obvious, but I'll just give like one or two, okay? There's something called the healthy user bias, for example. It's a huge problem for a lot of these plant-based diet epidemiological research bases. Like, a lot of them are funded by Seventh-day Adventists, which is a vegetarian Christian sect who has a lot of power. They're one of the biggest educators around the world. They own a lot of major food companies, labs, stuff like that. So that's a confounding factor. But that's the case when it comes to everything. Funding has to come from someone, so it's worth taking into account, but not you don't ignore the results just because of a bias there. So what was I getting at? So we go back to these studies where we do see atherosclerosis, right? Healthy user bias. So we go back to these studies where we do see a connection between atherosclerosis and meat consumption. Well, if we look at the larger cultural context, there's a lot of factors that get mixed in. First of all, well, I'll just say this. I mean, most meat that's eaten in the U.S. and the U.K. is fast food, very low quality. It's eaten with a bun and fries and what is it, whatever it is, Big Gulp or whatever, like, and that's all fried in very low quality canola or vegetable or soybean oil, stuff like that. Not to say that the meat isn't bad on some level, but we have to take into account that it's generally, if someone's eating more meat, then they're probably eating more of those other things alongside it in these cultures. Um, and also to get more to really explain the healthy user bias, well, I mean, and studies have been done on this as well. In these cultures, meat is associated culturally. It's the cultural narrative that meat is less healthy for you. So people who overall take into account more healthy habits, they get they buy organic food, they avoid smoking, they exercise, they get outside, they're in the sun, they're aware of the importance of social connection. They care. They're people who care in general. That is generally associated with better health. Those people tend to avoid meat in the States and Canada, say, and the UK. That is the cultural narrative. The types of people who eat more meat are the people who care less. They're the ones who drink more, smoke more, engage in more impulsive and risk-taking behavior. It's the James Dean type, as it's often said. It's rebel without a cause, to some degree. So, do these epidemiological studies take into account smoking habits, drinking, and are these factors being taken into account separately from the meat consumption? In some they are, but usually there's no study that shows all of these factors. Like, how do you fill out a survey like that? That's just one fallacy. I mean, also, we know very well that people are terrible at filling out these forms. First of all, a surprising portion of the population lies very consistently about their what they're filling in, based off of what they feel like they should say or what kind of impression they want to make, even though it's anonymous. I know it sounds silly, but I mean, well, who gives a shit? And most of these people don't even care that much about the results of the study. So, and the actual portions of food that they consume, people don't know how to measure out how much food they've eaten. A lot of the time, people, actually most of these kinds of epidemiological nutritional studies, they get filled out, and what we see is people consuming either, usually so few calories that they would basically not be alive. But that's just how they fill it out. Chances are they're eating more calories than they actually need, but they are just, they're not good at actually, eyeing a quantity of food and being like, okay, that's a pound versus 3 ounces. They don't know the difference. I could go on. And there's actually, I think, over a dozen major fallacies with epidemiological studies. And this is, again, it's one of the basics in science, correlation versus causation. Basically, I'm just trying to illustrate to you here how truth-seeking is taken into account and how often things that don't actually get to the root of the cause, don't really look at all the factors, question and look at many different angles. These kinds of studies, weak studies, are actually the majority of studies in general, and they often make assumptions and jump to conclusions and then get thrown around as if they were fact. And this isn't just in nutrition, this is in general. There are so many control factors necessary to actually figure things out. So, versus epidemiology, what is considered what would I consider an actual study? Something that's a bit more rigorous? Well, there's quite simply what is called a control trial, or observational trials, studies. Uh, it's the placebo-controlled, double-blind kind of thing. What that means is you have people in a controlled environment who are being observed, who are being fed a specific diet, and who have all kinds of biomarkers being tracked regularly. And this is expensive stuff. You can't do this with more than, at most, usually a couple hundred people, and even then, that's rare, and not for long either. I don't think I've ever seen a control trial with more than 10, 20 people that's gone on for more than a couple of months. And that's rare. Most of them are a couple of weeks to a month, maybe 6 weeks. 10 to 20 people. And how many factors can they keep track of? That is a lot of work. Maybe they're just tracking half a dozen blood markers or something like that. Does that really give us the full picture of what's going on? No. It gives us a snapshot. And yes, that is real science, but even then, we can't make final decisions about anything. Say again, we're talking about diet. We put people on, we find 4 or 5 groups, and they each get a different diet, and we're tracking, say, 24 blood markers or something like that. And even like psychological assessments and everything like that. This is huge budget. I don't know a lot of companies that will put the money into this kind of a study, other than occasionally in pharmaceuticals. Well, what do we find in those studies? First of all, we see very different results and different conclusions than the epidemiology, because when we're actually looking at mechanisms and assessing and tracking the factors, the variables, of course we're going to get a more nuanced, detailed perspective. But even then, if we have 100 people, say, that's a pretty good sample size for observational trial. And we see 80% of people getting certain results with a certain diet. But then 20% of people have a very different result. Well, we can't just say that, well, in that case, which is most cases, we see that with medication, with diet, with lifestyle factors, people react differently. There's usually a majority that acts a certain way, but then a minority who have a different expression, manifestation of results. In that case, we can't say that what is being tested applies to everybody, because that's still a good percentage of the population, 20%. And this is one small sample size, 100 people out of billions on the planet. It could be completely misrepresenting the average person. And who knows, maybe something about their environment or a very, very small detail about the diet changes the results completely. It's like people talking about high-fat diets being unhealthy because they see what appears to be negative results in certain biomarkers, in a couple of biomarkers, in rats consuming high-fat diets, but the high-fat part is usually mostly soybean oil or low-grade peanut oil or something like that. You can't say that applies to human beings consuming, say, healthy fats, avocado, good quality animal fats. No matter what your opinion is, you can't, by extension, assume that it applies the same way. And I'm not kidding. There are a lot of studies saying high-fat diets are bad for everybody because this rat seems to be not doing so good on a very high soybean oil diet, which still contains a mix of other things. That's insane. But this actually gets passed off as science because it's cheap, it's easy to do, it's easy to get funding for. And the more you make claims and you manage to pass it off as something that is of value, then you're going to get more funding. You're going to attract more attention, and more companies, more government bodies, institutions, people are going to be interested in giving you a job and doing research for whatever they want you to prove. If you actually look at the necessary standards for calling something true and real, if we really get down to the nitty-gritty, I mean, no human has the lifespan or the ability to perceive necessary to say anything is absolutely true in all cases. That's the height of hubris, of arrogance. There are some things I agree are more likely to, much more likely to be fact, because we have research that has been done again and again and again, and it's usually stuff that is repeatable, easily repeatable. Often it's in vitro, meaning individual cells in a petri dish, as opposed to in vivo, in a human being. Then the two, like a cell acts differently in a petri dish than in an organism, but there are some denominators, recurring factors and actions or processes or mechanisms, right? That we see again and again and again, and we have for 100, 200 years. Those things I can understand if someone says it's scientific fact. But people rarely talk about that stuff, and it blows me away the longer I've been looking at this stuff, how few people actually really know the biochemistry, how few people actually really look at the statistics, the mathematics behind the assumptions and the truth claims that are made based off of vague studies that are often controlled for variables, often funded by biased groups, often done by researchers who have certain paradigms in their culture, in their academic and scientific circles, that if they challenge, they will be attacked for. You would like to think that humans are objective, clear thinking, and we can be. We absolutely can be, but it's not as simple as we like to think. It's rare. We see it again and again in academic spheres. We can just look at the Nazis. The Nazis were highly industrious people, highly effective, efficient engineers, scientists. They had the Panzer tanks, which everyone was amazed by because it was basically like a modern-day dragon. It took a number of regular tanks to take one down. Well, these scientists, these so-called objective people, they also pushed for eugenics, which is the science of basically racism. The idea that we should encourage a master race or some crap like that. But where did that come from? That was a trickle down from the cultural narrative, the social circles, the way people thought in that environment. It affected the scientists no matter how seemingly objective they are. And in fact, I would say the people who think that they're the most objective are the ones who are repressing the cultural narrative that is controlling the way that they see things the most. We have something called a reticular activating system in our brain. It based off of what we believe to be true, the things that we value, the things that we search for, it will be programmed in a way to filter information and make us see things a certain way. Again, it doesn't mean that we can't be objective to a degree, as best we can, but we have to always take it into the context of, well, I could be wrong. This could be my subjective experience. I could have a failing in my ability to perceive things and make sense of things. I'm just so fucking tired of the arrogance I see out there in the world. The amount of people saying things are this way or that way. Aren't you fucking tired of that shit? Can't we be reasonable human beings and be like, hey, this is how I see things. These are the things that we've agreed on for a long time and that we can pretty well verify. Shouldn't we be making it clear the levels of certainty that we're functioning on? Because we're fucking not at all. Like I think I said this in the last recording I did, is the editor of The Lancet, one of the most recognized medical scientific journals, actually probably the most recognized and prestigious, came out with a statement saying chances are more than 50% of published studies are unfalsifiable, unverifiable, and maybe even fraudulent. The peer review system, you know what peer review means? Everyone says, oh, this is a peer-reviewed study. Well, what peer review means is that a peer, someone, a deigned professional or expert in the field, reviews the study and basically agrees with it or doesn't agree with it. But that's not verifying, that's not doing the study and repeating it. Repeatability is huge, is incredibly important. The standards of peer review have gone down the shitter in the last 40, 50, 60 years because it's not comfortable. It's not profitable. You can't control the science. You can't control the truth. But those with a lot of money, those with a lot of influence, they want to. They want to stay in their places. They want to be able to hold on to their positions of power, to the worldview that they sell you and have you agree with, and thus basically step under their authority through, for very normal human reasons. I understand. I understand that once you have that much power, I have not experienced that much power. I've experienced power, but I haven't experienced that much power. You know, an influence in the world as like one of the top academics or something like that. I don't know how addictive that is. I can't judge these people. But I do have to be wary of them. We have to take these things into account if we want to figure out what the fuck is true. Because at this point, the truth is breaking down so much. There are people who think that truth is completely relative. That is bullshit. There's people who think that everything is just chaos, 100% chaos, just particles bouncing off of each other. Yet, we know in physics that those particles bouncing off of each other act in very specific ways in different situations. So that means that there are factors in place. There are laws, the laws of physics. That's just one aspect of it, of the objectivity that does seem to exist. And look, maybe on a large scale, a lot of these laws, or all of them even, can be bent. But we can't say that for sure. And to say that everything is relative just off the bat and assume that is ridiculous. It's assuming that you can make such an assessment, first of all, that you have the awareness, the information, the certainty necessary to make a global statement like that. Anyways, see, I do this with everything. I break it down to what can actually be verified, which is very, very, very little. You have to accept your limitations. You have to become humble and accept that you are limited by how much you can sense. You have 5 senses, and then you have some deductive ability and memory. All of those are fallible. Yes, we can use those to do our best to try to figure things out. And you can include intuition into that. I would say that intuition is a valid tool in trying to figure things out, but you can't use it alone. You can't use just your eyes and your fingers and your nose and your touch to figure everything out. You can't use those to prove large mathematical concepts, for example. You can't prove with your eyes and your nose and your fingers right here, right now, that the sun is going to come up tomorrow morning. You have to rely on memory for that. So you have to use all of these in conjunction and recognize their limitations. And that might seem terrifying because that means we are faced with a seemingly infinite sea of unknowns. But if that seems terrifying, I want to ask you, why are you projecting the worst onto that unknown? Because you've experienced the worst in the past? Because you've had certain traumas which have marked you and made you assume that, the universe as a whole is overall bad? Well, again, you can't make those assessments based off of your experience. Your experience is not a scientifically valid, final criteria to make any kind of judgment on that scale. Who knows, maybe the last 50,000 years have all been crap overall, but some kind of intrinsic factor is going to come along and free us from that at any moment and switch the balance to mostly in our favor. Of course, most people think, okay, chances are the world is cold, uncaring, dead, alien, it's unmerciful, there's no life to it. Well, I'm going to once again say there is no proof for that. There is no proof of the opposite either. Again, we're talking about what can actually be proved and to what level. I think I'm making myself clear here at this point. I think. I hope that you can't make judgments at that level. You have to always be open if you want to be honest. Of course, it doesn't mean that you should ignore everything you're doing, assuming that it's probably all wrong or all right or anything, and just constantly take in new information and new ideas. I like doing that to a degree, but you do have to act in your life day to day, so you do have to make your best judgments off of what you have. And then beyond that, you have to trust. And that is terrifying. That is inconceivable for a lot of people because, well, trusting, I don't trust the world. I don't trust people. They've fucked me over. Look at the way the world is today. It seems terrible. Well, again, that's your judgment making a call. You're telling yourself that the world is in a bad place. And yes, there is suffering, it seems, at least in your interpretation of the world. But how do you know that that doesn't play an important role in something better, something bigger? Basically, I can keep saying what ifs, right? Infinitely. For the positive or the negative. But what it comes down to is, how do you actually function? And it comes back to what I was saying. You have to make the best decisions you can off of the information that you have, based and choosing from that information based on your judgment And ideally, maybe you can find some epistemological methods, I'm terrible with these words, to assess what is better quality information versus lower quality information, more verified versus less verified. And then beyond that, you have to trust. Because if you're constantly projecting an emotional sense of, oh, it's probably not going to work out, or it's all fucked up anyways, or on the other end, this over-the-top sense of optimism of it's all going to work out perfectly in exactly the way I think it is based off of my limited judgment. Well, that's not verifiable either. You have to be neutral for the most part, and there's some leeway there. So I would say it's perfectly safe to lean on a slight amount of optimism, because you really don't know. And look, there's always something to be grateful for. I could talk about that all day. There's always something to look at in your world and appreciate. So if that thing exists, chances are there is more. And it's always there. You just breathe, take a few deep breaths, enjoy it. What are you projecting emotionally, subconsciously as a narrative onto the unknown? And how is that affecting what you're doing day to day? And how much are you assuming things and taking things for granted? How much is that stopping you from trying new things that might work better? And from questioning what you believe today? Those are some of the most important questions, in my opinion. And it really can transform you on a level I can't even describe. It can give you a sense that, hey, maybe there is some kind of connection to the outside world. Maybe there is some kind of back and forth, a relationship with something fundamental in existence. Because anyways, if we actually look at the hierarchy of evidence, everything that we do is assessed through subjective experience. So there's a lot of scientists, a lot of physicists. You can look up Robert Lanza. He's a biologist, but he's generally recognized as one of the most prolific scientists in the world today. And he has a philosophy called biocentrism. You can read his books. They're fantastic. And he underlines again and again how the science points to the fact that it appears that consciousness is primary to matter or equivalent to it. Meaning that, look, if we talk about the outside world or the world of physicality, you can only use words, which are thoughts, and concepts, which are experiences in your consciousness, to conceive of those things. If I touch this bottle I'm holding, that sense of physicality, of sensation, is just a sensation, a signal in my brain or my consciousness. My brain could just be this really fucks with people's heads sometimes. The brain could just be a construct of consciousness. Consciousness might come before the brain, because we can only experience things subjectively first. And we see in quantum physics that subatomic particles are affected, or seemingly are affected, in very strange ways by the way that we're perceiving them. The waveform collapse and everything. A lot of people make a lot of assumptions of woo-woo new age stuff based off of this, but it is still fascinating if we look at it for its bare facts. Robert Lanza, lots of physicists believe that consciousness needs to be taken into account as likely something that comes before matter or comes together with matter. So, what would that say about the universe as a whole and what you're projecting onto the unknown? Maybe the universe as a whole experiences something like consciousness. It might be very alien to us in the context of us experiencing things through a biological limited body, but as a whole, how do we even know that the universe as a whole doesn't look like a biological being? It could be a massive brain, right? I'm just giving some examples here. It's very possible that the universe is alive on a deep, deep level that we haven't recognized as a global culture and a scientific culture to a large degree. So maybe there is some goodness, maybe there is some reciprocity. Maybe there is some kind of connection that we can have with the outside universe, and some good, some kind of harmony, as again, I keep coming back to this word, a relationship that isn't totally cold, dead, and unmerciful. And if you think about it, if that is the case, I think that the attitude, coming to the world with the attitude of being cold, dead, and uncaring, makes you cold, dead, and uncaring. And if you're acting like a free agent in a system that is based off of harmonization, resonance, as in like synchronization, as we see in the body, all the cells kind of experience an independent reality, but they work together because they have to, and that's what works best. Well, in the world, if you're acting like that in the world, if you're not acting like that in the world, you're acting like, no, you know what, it's all pointless, it's all dead. Well, maybe you're going to get a response that is equivalent. Maybe if you're coming to the world with that attitude, you're going to be treated like a cancer cell that acts on its own. The same way, right? I'm not saying that this is the case, but these are perspectives that we can look at from very rational points of view. And of course, these aren't absolutely verifiable. So I'm not saying to assume that these things are true, but they are options that are just as valid as what most people believe, which is, cold, dead, uncaring universe, just a bunch of cells and particles bouncing off of each other, pure chaos, blah, blah, blah. Which is bullshit. Actually, I would say that the reasoning I've given so far for the opposite view, the biocentric or living universe perspective, is much more valid than the average nihilistic cold dead universe model or view. But I could give a lot of good arguments, a lot of much better arguments than are usually given for the cold dead universe as well. So how are you going to function? What are you going to assume? What is worth assuming? What is more backed up? Huh? Really be honest with yourself, because you're not going to change anything. You're not going to see any improvements in how you feel and how you see things until you are dead fucking honest with yourself. Brutally honest with yourself. And I'm not saying to that you have to do that all at once. It's a slow thing. You have to just, when thoughts come up and you have the time to sit with them, you look at them, you look at that thought one by one, and you ask yourself, is this really serving me? Is this really a fact? Am I imagining this? Even things that you've seen, when there are car crashes, when there are 12 different witnesses, most of them will see very different things and absolutely be certain of it as a fact, but down to the color of the cars and where they were. It's the sounds that happened, everything. Your sense perception is fallible as well, and your memory of what you perceived even a few seconds ago is fallible to a degree. How much? We don't know. But you gotta just do your best with what you have, while still taking into account that you might be projecting and filling in projecting a lot of assumptions and filling in a lot of gaps, using likely things like things that are pre-programmed into your reticular activation system and your limbic system, such as your identity, your views on the world, your assumption on how things work, your emotional experience and traumas of the past. Once you start playing with the meaning that you're associating to things and the little bits of memory that you're filling in, the more you break these down and you play with them, the more you're going to see reality shifting in ways that are hard to explain. Very subtle, but yet very, very real. I mean, just look at the way algorithms are set up today. Just look at, even if there weren't algorithms in, say, Google. What I'm talking about is when you do a search, Google tends to, and other websites tend to take into account your history, the things that you've searched before. And so it will kind of lean you, if you say, let's just talk left versus right, politically. If you have a left-leaning, if you're left-leaning, and Google is overall more left-leaning, they've been very public about that opinion, but still, okay, I'll say, if you are right-leaning, chances are, over time, when you do more searches on Google, you will get more right-leaning results. Well, even then, even if it was just objective, no algorithm, and you do research regularly, what people do a lot of the time is that they have an assumption, and then they do research to kind of validate that assumption. And then they'll ignore the stuff that goes against what they said, and they'll just focus on the evidence that backs what they say, what they already believe, or what they already feel, right? Big distinction there that is important. And then that gets worse over time. And maybe you are fairly objective going into it, but then you develop a leaning in one direction or another. And then after that, it kind of it's like a compounding effect, right? It grows very quickly in that direction, and you really try to validate that. So yeah, that's probably what I wanted to say. I hope that was clear. I hope that I didn't cause you to have to face an existential crisis that was that you've been repressing for a very long time. Because I've talked about this stuff to people and they've burst out crying. Because this stuff is stuff that we all know. It's all very simple, really, once you get down to it. It's all very intuitive. Because we know it honestly deep down that we aren't, these objective, all-seeing, omniscient beings. But we repress it enormously. Because it's not really acceptable to talk like this in a lot of circles. It doesn't seem practical at first to most people. Usually coming from the perspective that your perception is, clear, and that things are obvious. And we're told when we're young that things are this way or that way, and we take on assumptions without much conscious or critical thought from a very, very early age. We all have baggage. So it kind of starts us off from a bad point, a difficult place, which works very well in like a tribal setting, which we would have been in and evolved in for millions of years. But when we're talking about a global culture or a near international global economy and the politics going on nowadays and the war going on in the healthcare world, basically everything's coming to a head. And this kind of basic awareness is so basic that I think it can really benefit a lot of people. I don't know if this is the kind of thing that will be able to spread because it's not something that people are very comfortable with, and people, tend to, when the world seems like it's in a hard place, everyone kind of, groups up and tries to find that comfort in community and the things that they believe to be true and and the ideas that they're comfortable with and the identity that they're comfortable with. So I don't really expect I don't expect these to be ideas that spread enormously, but hopefully it can really help individuals, and maybe it can spread from there, because you really do have to focus first on yourself and lead from example. I've noticed that this has helped me enjoy my life so much more, find a lot more peace of mind, though of course it does it does cause me to get triggered a lot by people making absolutist statements, but you develop a thicker skin through that too. You come to understand that it's not their fault. It's very understandable that people make claims like that. And who am I? Who are you to say that they're wrong, right? You have to consider what they're saying. All to say, ultimately, I think overall, it's made me a lot more peaceful, a lot happier, a lot more accepting of people and myself and situations that might seem unpleasant on the surface. And I believe that has helped those who are around me. I've had a lot of people thank me for helping them with this way of seeing things, and the things that has brought, because a lot that trickles down from this. When you approach the world like this, it becomes very, how do I say it? It gives you a better place from which to make assessments and make decisions from a little bit more objectively, and you tend to recognize it more in others. I find that people who have things to share, information to share, but who have more of this attitude tend to be more spot on about the information that they're sharing. At least in my experience, and at least in my testing of that information as much as I can, verifying it, it overall is a better framework from which to do anything. So yeah, maybe I'll be able to map it out more clearly in the future, but I hope this was helpful. And I wish everyone the best, no matter how much they disagree with me, how much they hate me, if at all, how much we might differ on certain views. I really do wish every individual the best, because beyond our opinions and our views and our even our contempt and our negative feelings towards one another and the world, we are all in this together. I mean, I hate using that sentence because it's so cliche, but we are all just doing our fucking best. And that's another thing, is I've been able to find compassion for people who clearly have no compassion towards me, and really feel it, and act towards them in ways that are constructive and while staying calm, because I can see that ultimately we are very innocent, and it's very sad what we've put ourselves through, and what we're experiencing a lot of the time, usually entirely of our own fault. So yeah, I really do hope this is helpful. I found this helpful just to talk about because it's fun. It's good to express oneself. So yeah, no regrets. At the very, very worst, if everyone hates this, or if no one ever hears this or anything, at least I got something out of it, right? So that's a win. Later all.